What would you do if soldiers suddenly turned up at your church and dragged out everyone inside, burned every Bible they could find, and then demolished the building piece by piece while government officials watched from a balcony? This isn't a dystopian nightmare. This actually happened. And it happened all across the Roman Empire, all on the same day by imperial decree. Welcome back to Early Christian History. Today, we are looking at the most intense systematic persecution the early church ever faced. The Great Persecution under the Emperor Diocletian in AD 303. And here's the twist. It failed spectacularly. And today, I'm going to tell you why. The stage for the Great Persecution was set a few years earlier in 299 at the imperial court in Antioch. Picture this if you can. The empire's most powerful officials gathered for a ceremony, an augury ritual, where priests would examine animal entrails to discern the divine will, find out what the gods want for the Roman Empire. It's a standard procedure used for making decisions in the Roman world, but at this particular ritual, something went wrong. It was noticed that there were Christians in attendance, and they were crossing themselves as they watched the ritual take place. Now, according to some pagan priests, this simple gesture of crossing oneself disrupted their ability to read the omens. The gods, they claimed, had gone silent, and it was the Christians who were to blame. The emperor's response to this was swift and punitive. Diocletian had every palace official and courtier ordered to offer sacrifices to the Roman gods. And those who refused, well, they were publicly scourged and then dismissed from service. After that came a broader decree, a broader edict. Every soldier in the entire Roman military machine had to prove their loyalty by offering sacrifices to the gods. Now, in practice, that would mean if there were any Christians serving in the legions, men who had served Rome faithfully in numerous campaigns, they now had to choose between their faith and their lives. But this was just the beginning. There were more edicts still to come. And we get one particular edict on one particular day, February the 23rd of 303. This is the day where everything changed, where Diocletian launched, in effect, a surprise attack against the church. Now, this was during a particular festival of the god Terminus, whose name literally means boundary or end. And an edict was issued from the imperial capital in Nicomedia in modern-day Turkey. And the symbolism of the decree with the day is very clear. This was meant to be the terminus, the end of Christianity. The orders were comprehensive and quite devastating. Imperial officials with armed guards were to destroy all Christian churches. They were to burn all Christian sacred texts. All Christians of noble birth were stripped of their rank and status. All Christians were to be expelled from the military service and the civil service, and they removed all legal rights and protections from Christians. Now, let that last one sink in. It meant Christians became persona non grata. They were non-persons under Roman law. You could be robbed, killed, assaulted, pretty much anything goes, and you would have no legal recourse whatsoever. Now, when the edict was first put into effect, it started off with something of a bang, even in the imperial epicenter at Nicomedia. It began with a surprise attack, a bit like, Order 66 in Star Wars. Let me paint the picture to you as to what happened, because this is a scene that played out in different ways, but similarly across various cities of the empire. So you've got to imagine the Emperor Diocletian with his junior co-emperor Galerius standing on the balcony of the imperial palace in Nicomedia, sometime around dawn. And they're watching their soldiers carry out the first raid. The troops storm a church building. Any worshippers found inside are beaten and thrown out into the streets. Soldiers confiscate anything of value. They gather up scrolls, codices, any Christian writings they can find, and they set them ablaze. Then comes the demolition. The church is torn down piece by piece with axes. It's not quick, it's not efficient, it's deliberate, it's methodical, it's meant to send a message to everyone watching. We are going to eradicate Christianity from the landscape. So it wasn't just persecution, it was politics, it was theatre. This was the empire demonstrating its absolute power over a religious movement that it saw as a threat. But that does lead to a question, why did the Romans bother persecuting Christians? Why did Diocletian do this? Now, on the one hand, you could say, he was just a tyrant and, tyrants got to tyrannize. That's kind of what they do, but it's far more than that. Diocletian, like other emperors before him, had a totalizing vision, okay? I call this imperial totalism, where everything in the empire was meant to work together like a well-oiled machine. The military, the vast bureaucracy, the infrastructure, the coinage, the calendar, the festivals, everything was put in service of the empire's operation. Everything had to be subordinated to the empire. Everything had to be streamlined to serve the empire's success. And Diocletian had done a lot of work reorganizing the empire. He'd divided it amongst 4 rulers called the Tetrarchs. He reformed the tax system, strengthened the borders, the various wars on the frontiers. He tried to stabilize the currency. And he was kind of an administrative genius in many ways. But here's the kicker. This is what you've got to remember. In Diocletian's system, religion, or cult, or whatever you want to call it, you can't just leave that to people's private consciences and interests. Religion had to serve the empire's aims. The gods worshipped had to be the gods who blessed and patronized the Roman people, the Roman Empire. And loyalty to these gods was loyalty to Rome itself. Or let me give you an analogy. If you start messing with the peace with the gods, it's like you're trying to sabotage the economy, or it's like you're trying to poison public sanitation or public hygiene. This isn't just a personal act of religious devotion. What you're doing can have negative repercussions for the entire fabric of the city, the province, the empire itself. I also have to add, in this framework, the emperors themselves were, somewhat semi-divine beings, standing at the boundary between humanity and the divine realm. So religion wasn't about personal devotion or eternal truths that have great gravity in your own heart. It was about imperial unity and social control. In light of this imperial totalism, what do you do with a religion that says we have one Lord and it's not the emperor? A religion that claims that ultimate loyalty belongs to a crucified Judean peasant who died some 100 or more years ago, 300 years ago, thereabouts. And that it's the crucified Nazarene, Jesus, who is the ultimate Lord, not the Augustus, not the Caesar, not the procurators or the various legionary commanders around the empire. In Diocletian's imperial world, in his imperial totalistic society, that just wasn't being antisocial. It wasn't just heresy or blasphemy, it was treason. But Diocletian's persecution soon pitted out. because Diocletian made a catastrophic miscalculation. He assumed that sufficient force, sufficient violence and deterrence and detrimental actions would eliminate the ideology of the Christians, and that through enough intimidation and enough torture and persecution, they could break the resistance and the defiance of the churches. He didn't understand a fairly simple truth that persecutors throughout history have failed to grasp an important thing. You cannot kill an idea, and you certainly cannot kill a religion. I mean, how do you intimidate people with death when they're willing to die for what they hold most precious? How do you break people who believe that death is not the end, but only the beginning of a more glorious and sublime future? You know, how do you break people who trust that even in suffering, and suffering for Christ will lead ultimately to glory with Christ? The early Christians had something that the empire couldn't break. It couldn't steal. It couldn't tear down. It couldn't torture into submission. And that was hope. Hope in the resurrection. Hope in justice. Hope in a kingdom that is everlasting and won't fade away long after the Roman Empire had. So, by the end of 303, less than a year after Diocletian had launched his persecution, Diocletian had to launch an amnesty. He conceded defeat. Christianity was simply too big, too widespread, and too deeply rooted to eradicate. The Great Persecution had damaged the church, certainly. Many had suffered, many had died. Many churches lay in ruins, but Christianity itself, it was still standing. It was still kicking along. In fact, and this is fiercely ironic, within a decade, Constantine would legalize Christianity. And within a generation after that, Christianity would become the dominant religion of the empire. The very empire that tried to destroy Christianity would, in the end, embrace it. So, what can we take away from this story? First, persecution has never succeeded in destroying the Christian faith. Not under Nero, not under Domitian, not under Diocletian, not under any regime for the last 2 millennia. As Tertullian said, the blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church. Second, the gospel doesn't need the patronage or protection of political powers to survive. In fact, it often thrives without it. The early church grew rapidly when it had the least political influence. Third, Christian faith is worth suffering for. The early church, the first Christians, they faced a choice that seemed impossible. Deny Christ, keep your life, your property, your status, your rights, or confess Christ and lose everything. Everything you own, value, relationships, prestige, houses, wealth, everything, your own life. What did many of them choose? Well, some did choose their own lives, but a great many chose Christ. We've got to ask the question, would we pray that we would receive a suitable spirit of courage to be able to make the good confession when the day comes? Finally, empires rise and fall. Rome seemed invincible in 303. Where is it now? Mostly in museums or being gawked at by tourists. But the church that Diocletian tried to destroy, it's still there, still standing, still growing, and still proclaiming that Jesus is Lord. Let me add a little addendum there. One of the big things that Diocletian did is he created an imperial college of 4 emperors to run the empire. So it was him, Maximian, Galerius, and Constantius. And one of the best images we have of the Tetrarchs today is located on the Basilica of St. Mark's facade in modern-day Venice. This was a relief that was initially in Byzantium, modern-day Istanbul, but Crusaders brought it back from, the Bosphorus all the way through back to Italy, where it now is used as artwork adorning a church. And you have the four tetrarchs there effectively guarding the church that they once tried to destroy. Hashtag Jesus won that contest. I hope you enjoyed this episode of Early Christian History focusing on Diocletian's persecution of the church. If you've enjoyed it, please like, subscribe, punch that notification button. Also, in the comments, let me know what you think. Feel free to ask any questions. And also, I'd love to hear, are there any episodes of church history or even from the New Testament period that you'd like me to cover next? Until then, thanks for watching. I look forward to seeing you around the channel.